figure out, how do you put yourself in front of the tsunami, right? That's what we're all trying to figure out in this game, right? Is where's the next avalanche of money going to hit? I want to get there first and put myself in front of it. So, a lot of eyes looking at the gold sector, a lot of eyes looking at the copper sector. We've got a whole deep dive on copper where we're asking the question, is what is peak cheap copper? Are we there? Right? Or is it close? If you look at the forecast coming out of even Davos this week, they're waving the flag for EV everything. Well, it's like, it's going to take a lot of metals. So I'm just really curious.
Principally copper. Can't do without copper.
A lot of it, it makes it a pretty simple bet, to be honest with you. You don't have to get too nuanced with the energy metals to just look at what's the best conductor, and it's going to be needed in everything, no matter which direction battery chemistry goes.
Welcome to In It to Win It. This is Steve Barton, and thank you for tuning in. Today, I am here with Jay Martin of Cambridge House. Jay is north of the border up in Canada. He's got a resource investment conference coming up. I am super excited. I'm flying out here shortly to go up. It's got a rock star lineup. Robert Kiyosaki, Rick Rule, Brent Johnson of the Dollar Milkshake Theory, the Economic Ninja is going to be there, and even Ross Beatty. So, Jay, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure, Steve. I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, so am I. So am I. So if you could just kind of give us maybe a quick 2-minute how you got started as a kid. You took over Cambridge House from your father, and I believe this is your 12th conference running that you've been putting on. How did you go from as a young man to where you are holding conferences of this magnitude?
Sure. Yeah. 12 years, which is about 105 conferences at this point, I think. And that's correct. I purchased a family business in 2011. It was sort of a leveraged takeout scenario. And at that point in time, Cambridge House was a specialist in junior mining investment conferences. And we had about 11 conferences across North America. Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, Toronto, Palm Springs, San Francisco. We were all over the place. Obviously, in 2011, that market fell off a cliff. Junior mining just crashed aggressively, and we were holding a bunch of assets that we didn't want anymore. And so we went through a big company restructure. As the market crashed, obviously, as did our clientele in those years. And I think we saw at that point something like 86% of our clients from 2011 to 2015 either become defunct or just unable to afford any marketing campaigns. And so near shut down the company, restructured, cleaned house in terms of the conferences that we used to run, diversified into the tech sector, the drone sector, the cannabis sector, threw all kinds of Hail Marys to keep this beast alive. And it worked, right? And we stuck with our bread and butter as our core focus, which was the precious metal sector, and it still is today. But it's been a ride. It's been super fun. I guess, as a consequence, I cut my teeth as an investor during some really tough years in the junior mining sector. I'm really grateful for that, because I recall in 2010, there was shoulder to shoulder investors at any event that anybody was doing, and everybody was making money, and every company was getting financed, and everybody and their cab driver were giving stock tips. And it was a frothy precious metals market. When the market crashes, there's an exodus of people from the space very quickly. The benefit to that is that if you're willing to stick around and stay working, you can elevate your network really fast. And that was a key activity that kept us alive during those bear market years, to be honest with you, because the easy money leaves, the productive money stays, the real entrepreneurs stick around. And maybe in 2010, if I couldn't get a meeting with Ross Beatty, I could get one in 2014 because there weren't as many people asking, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it was very beneficial, and I'm really grateful for that. Very, very grateful. Was an entrepreneur beforehand, had a couple smaller businesses in the health and wellness and the tourism industry, but eventually, ended up doing what I do now. So we obviously went on pause during the pandemic years. Recently decided to resurrect our flagship conference, which is the VRIC this January. we'll have about 5,000 investors this year. The notable part about that is that we had less than 2,000 last year, right? And, I watched this from an investor sentiment standpoint, right? Like, why would more than double the amount of investors want to come to a precious metals investment conference this year versus 12 months ago? Like, what's going on in the sentiment landscape? And you just have to say, the market's more bullish than it was a year ago. As a consequence, if twice as many investors show up, 2.5 times actually, that just means they're coming to write checks. More money enters the industry, more companies get financed, more exploration can occur. Like, this is, I've seen this rodeo before. It's the early stages of a bull market. And we're seeing the expression of interest from the money side. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I only found this sector maybe a couple of years ago, other than having a very small allocation of my portfolio to GLD. And then I learned that was just was entirely based on paper and had no real value. So I'm very grateful to have found this. And I am super excited for this next cycle. How do you get some of these guests? I mean, Robert Kiyosaki, like, how do you land him?
You know what? This was a gift that we received from the pandemic shutdown, Steve. So let me tell you, like, when we were just doing events, and that was all we did, which is all we did up until 2020. You had your network of keynote speakers, newsletter writers. You're always trying to hunt down new talent, but it's tough. When events got shut down, and I kind of feel like we were a bit fortunate in that regard, because some industries, they weren't sure how that would impact them. Live event production, like, we knew on day one, right, this is going to be significant. So we pivoted quickly, built a media company, main assets there, YouTube channels, podcasts, and subscription newsletters. But without the barriers of travel logistics, suddenly we were able to get all sorts of people on the show, which is the same as getting them on stage back in the event days. They could come on the show much easier. And so we ended up with relationships with individuals like Robert Kiyosaki, like Jim Rogers. We had the former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, come onto the podcast and onto the channel. They never would have come to events back then because we didn't know them. But there was a brief window of time where everybody was trapped at home with nothing to do, and they were pretty keen to do something, And so we recognized that opportunity. We're aggressive with our outreach, got in touch with all kinds of new people. And as a consequence, Prime Minister Harper came in person last year to the 2022 VRIC. Robert Kiyosaki is coming in person this year to the 2023 VRIC. So, we were really lucky that there was that window of opportunity. We struck while the iron was hot, got a bunch of new guests on the podcast, built relationships, and that's now carrying forward. We did have Brent Johnson. Actually, he launched his first dollar milkshake speech at our San Francisco conference in, was that like 2018? It was the first like public explanation of what the milkshake theory was. And that video went bonkers since then anyways. But so that's kind of how. And then it's like anything, man. It's lead gen. You're always reaching out to new people and just hustling, trying to get new talents and new conversations, all that.
I like that. You turned COVID into an opportunity. That's what all entrepreneurs do, right? I met a businessman that I don't even remember what he made, but he was in manufacturing. And as soon as COVID hit, he stopped everything and started making masks and just made a killing. Right. I like the way you think. Okay. Can you talk about the trucker strike that happened in Canada? This affected me personally. I bought a house during this time, having drastically underestimated my construction costs for renovating a ADU in the back. I mean, I went to Home Depot expecting straight, dry 2x4s, to be $3 like they were before, and they were $14 for twisted wet ones. What happened with the trucker strike in Canada?
Well, this was a grassroots movement that caught global attention and ended up setting a standard, I think, for how civilians can respond to mandates they feel are unfair. That's what I saw occur. And, Canada is not a country that makes international headlines very often. But in the last couple of years, we have, for good reasons and bad. Absolutely. So as a Canadian watching this movement begin in the West and travel across the country, picking up steam every single mile of the way, there was two things to watch when this occurred. And this is the Canadian truckers opposing the mandates, right? And I think exercising their civil liberties, right? That's why we love democratic, free societies in theory, right? So this is what was occurring. There were two things happening when this happened, right? There was the boots on the ground movement, the individuals joining, driving, funding via the GoFundMe page, very reputable mainstream site that funds charitable concepts and ideas for anybody that needs help. And then there was the media coverage, which was a totally different thing. This was a campaign of demonizing individuals, of calling out all sorts of nefarious behavior, and labeling this convoy and this group as with a couple of real dramatic accusations about who the group consisted of, and calling them racist and the fringe minority and all the language we've heard by now. And this is really interesting because we're seeing this play out again in Canada right now. And it's not making as many international headlines this time, but I want to give it some airtime here because I'm covering this in depth at my show actually in a couple of days.
Oh, nice.
There's two provinces in Canada right now that have put forward legislation strictly to increase their own sovereignty with the intention of giving them the power to say no to federal overreach. So in Canada, we have the federal government and the provincial government, very similar to how the Fed and the states operate in the United States. The states retain a certain level of sovereignty, but the federal government does retain control over some bigger decisions. And in Canada, we have that. The provinces control their revenue streams, for example, but the federal government controls international shipping. So if you're a province like Alberta, laden, or Saskatchewan, laden with resources that the world needs, right? Potash for agriculture, oil and gas, you're landlocked, right? You can't actually get your products to the international market without the green light from the federal government. And two provinces specifically, Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are laden in oil, gas, uranium, potash, feel this has been the case, that they have been hamstrung by the federal government in terms of getting their product to the international marketplace. And they've put forward the Alberta Sovereignty Act and the Saskatchewan First Act. As I said, completely built to give them the power to say no to federal policy they deem being overreach. As this has played out, it's been very similar to the trucker convoy in that there's two stories occurring. There's a lot of support within the provinces. Alberta and Saskatchewan, both bills passed. And Saskatchewan passed unanimously, meaning bipartisan support. The NDP, like our Socialist Party, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, all voted unanimously in favor of this legislation. But if you look at the media coverage, coast to coast, all you see is the media demonizing this legislation, calling it dangerous, right? Saying that nobody wants this, least of all the individuals in the provinces. And so you have to look at this and say, what's going on? Like, why is there such a decoupling between what's actually happening on the ground in Canada today and for the last few years, and how it's being broadcasted federally from our media platforms like Global News, CTV, CBC, etc. And to deal with this, coming up in a couple of days, I've invited two former premiers. I like talking to politicians. I like getting inside the psychology of the decision-making of our elected leaders. Like it or not, it's valuable to understand, I believe. Oh, yeah. And so I've got the former premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, coming, and she's interesting to me because she's this is important. She's a pre-Justin Trudeau Liberal. Now that's something that matters, right? Liberal Party is Liberal Party, but there's been a big cultural shift in the last few years on the back of our federal leader. And Christy is the first to say that, right? This is from her mouth. I mean, I am titling our fireside chat at my conference on Sunday with Christy Clark, Remember When Liberals Were Smart. And this is straight from my pre-chat with her. And she's like, look, so I'll let her, but she's a firecracker and pulls no punches. and is ready to tell everybody exactly what she thinks of what's occurred to the Liberal Party in the last few years. So interesting to hear from what you might assume was a fairly left-leaning politician, but things have changed today. And then Brad Wall, who was the former premier of Saskatchewan, obviously a province that put this legislation forward, a premier who had his finger on many, again, of the resources. I mean, Saskatchewan's a province that really kind of has the world by the balls. If you think about what they have and what the world needs, if given the cooperation of the federal government, right, which they currently don't have. And so that's where all this dissent comes from. I mean, we recently had the Chancellor of Germany in Canada begging our prime minister for a natural gas deal to get them through the winter, right? Asking us for a commodity that we have now, that they need now, that they're willing to pay for now. And our prime minister sent him home, said no, and said he couldn't make a sound business case for that, which is, just leave that out there for people to make their own mind up about.
Marginally insane.
Instead, he promised hydrogen power, of which we don't have any. That's fine.
What?
For 2050, he said we'll work on providing hydrogen power. Now, if you look in the Government of Canada's website, yes, we have plans to have hydrogen as a contributing fuel source by 2050, right? So he sent him home.
I was going to say, I didn't know that Canada was an exporter of hydrogen, but you're not, right?
We're not. No.
Okay.
It's a near 30-year promise. And you know how valuable a 30-year promise is. So anyhow, that's kind of the lay of the land. So all of this leads me to believe that we're at the most pivotal point in Canadian politics since the Quebec referendum in the mid-90s. And then my two guests, my two former politicians, the premiers, they agree with that, right? Because I asked them both point blank, this is how I feel. What do you think? And they both said, yeah, 100%, right? And they'll say it again on stage on Sunday. So so that's kind of how, went on a tangent there, but you asked about the Freedom Convoy. And I just, it's important to keep people up to date on what is a very similar thread and narrative has evolved in this country, because that's how it started. And that's what we all know about. And that's what got global attention. But the movement hasn't stopped. And by the way, the federal government shut down the convoy with pretty dramatic measures and then came out and said, they had no impact on policy. But coincidentally, 2 weeks later, Canadian mandates were all lifted. So you tell me, right, whether or not they had an impact. I would say they had an amazing impact and they were very successful. And, that's not how it's been broadcasted. But I would say they should be very proud of what they did and that they achieved success because 2 weeks later, mandates were lifted. No one will acknowledge that it was them, but coincidentally it occurred. So, 1 + 1 here. Yeah.
Now, some of these poor people, this wasn't without consequence, right? I mean, some of them that contributed to this GoFundMe in support of this, their bank accounts were frozen, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Their financial assets were frozen by their own government, their own democratically elected government with no judicial process.
And that is so scary. I mean, because this is something I would imagine happening in Iraq or China or something, but this is Canada, and as an American citizen, that's not too far away. That's pretty close to home. You know what I mean? If Canada would do it, who won't?
That's the thing. And I think it's easy to think it was a special circumstance. Their back was against the wall. They had to act. They had reason to believe there was bad actors funding this thing. Yeah. But look, precedent was set. That's what I think about. Precedent was set, right? I mean, look at what's going on in terms of central banks rebalancing their reserves right now, following the United States confiscating $600 billion of USD reserves from Russia, right? What's occurred since then, right? Central banks all over the world are decreasing their exposure to USD in exchange for something else, whether that's in some cases euro, Australian dollars, or gold, largely gold. We're seeing that. That's because precedent was set. And so they're asking the same question that we should be asking up here. It's it's always hardest the first time, but once that door's open, the door's open. It's easier the second time, right? And so every country that's wondering, how safe is my safe haven asset? I thought USDs were the safest place to be in the world. It's well, relative to what? I mean, maybe, yeah, sure, right? But there's counterparty risk. And now we see what can happen with counterparty risk. Yep. And on a civilian level, yeah, a lot of people experience that in this country too. It's the same situation. I see it as very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, we're starting to move away from the petrodollar, and it's I think going to be very interesting, exciting, but got to have some safe haven. All right, maybe that will move us into precious metals. You're obviously a fan of gold and silver. Can you, when I first started understanding this a few years ago, you're really going against the grain here. Rick Rule told me that less than half of 1% of anyone owns anything in precious metals. So right there, you're one out of 200. You're going against the grain of Warren Buffett. He calls it a pet rock, and it's a big shiny thing. When did you get into this? Can you kind of give us your base case for it?
Well, 100%. So I think growing up in Vancouver, maybe you're more prone to becoming exposed to the precious metal sector because globally the exploration of those metals is largely financed in Canada, and 60% of that financing comes from Vancouver. So as a consequence, you might bump into people who are in that space more frequently where I grew up. So maybe an earlier exposure, but I didn't start taking action, honestly, Steve, until I became a father. That's when I started accumulating physical precious metals, and at a very, very slow, almost irrelevant rate, right? I was able to get my hands on a bit of silver coins, and I started buying some silver coins. And not a lot, like just, every once in a while, I just kind of thought like, you're hearing whispers about this and that and currency devaluation and sovereign debt bubbles and all this stuff. And you're like, well, I don't know, maybe, right? Just in case, maybe I'll start dipping my toe in the water here and trying to understand this. I have 3 kids now. I own a lot more metal. I mean, it's been a direct correlation to my liability, like my exposure, meaning my kids, like my family. That's the core assets I'm here to protect, and how much of an insurance policy, i.e. precious metals, that I want, right? And I think that's normal, right? I think as you have more responsibility and more reason to protect your livelihood, you might want to think more critically about what your insurance policy is for that worst case scenario. And look, like I'm not a doom and gloom forecaster. Like I'm the opposite of that. I'm perpetually optimistic, and I'm long human ingenuity. And I think that we're probably in for a chaotic decade. I think that the party's just getting started in terms of what's occurred so far in the 2020s. Like, the rest of this decade is probably going to be how the beginning of it's been, a continued unprecedented trajectory of chaos and uncertainty. I think so. That happens even in bull markets, right? Like my whole life's been a bull market, Steve. Like my quality of life's just gotten better, greater access to a wider variety of cheaper goods. I mean, I think though that's we're now entering an era of distrust. Globalization has been shattered. Our supply chains are being disrupted. Our access to goods are going to be impacted. Prices are going to go up. It's going to be very uncertain how we reassemble the necessities of life when we don't have access to labor from anywhere and fuel from anywhere, right? And minerals from anywhere. That's been the last 30 years. That's been the case. That's no longer the case. That era of global trust was fragile, and now it's over. And we're in this new era now, this new alignment, right? And call it East versus West. It's not quite that simple, but countries are going to think very critically about how they're going to protect access of the things they need, the commodities and ingredients that build the lives that you and I value. So anyways, with all that uncertainty, right, I can't imagine how you can study history and not want to have some asset, some exposure to what I think is the only asset that doesn't have any counterparty risk.
Yeah.
And you can say, look, I could buy land, right? I could own it outright. There's no bank loan on this. I have zero counterparty risk. And it's like, well, maybe, but that's a registered asset subject to tax policy, right? It's not necessarily completely counterparty free. Whereas this right here is, right?
Yep.
That 100-ounce silver shell.
Oh, the one you put on Twitter. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
That is very cool.
I won that in a bet.
Yeah.
And, and as is my gold, right? And so, I feel 2 ways about it, right? It's number one, it's an insurance policy. I hope to be a buyer exclusively for my entire life and never, ever need it. My intention is to leave it to my children. What a cool little parting gift, right?
Yeah. Money that's transferable over generations.
Yeah, right. And over generations, the rise and fall, I mean, the rise and fall of market cycles, let alone the rise and fall of empires, it's retained its purchasing power, right? And, 2000 to 5,000 years of histories, that doesn't mean it's going to last another 2000 to 5,000, but it's a pretty good bet, right?
Yeah.
People talk about, oh, is Bitcoin the new gold? I'm like, it's 15 years old. It's like you're comparing arable land to Facebook stock. Like, what are you talking about, right? Like, I'm not shunning Bitcoin. I own it. I have a horse in that race, man. For sure, I got exposure, but those aren't apples to apples at all. What are you talking about? They're completely different things. And anyway, so with the precious metals, it's like, yeah, physical, I want possession. I never want to need it. It's there for my kids to inherit one day, but there is utility. When people say there's no utility, they're missing the point. It's an option on liquidity. That's what it is. There's always a liquid market, right? There's always a liquid market. And I've exercised that. I exercised that last year, actually. I was trying to pick up a rental property here in the town that I live in. The market was beginning to correct. We knew rates were going to start going up soon. And I thought there might be like a brief window where a seller that wanted to drop his property in a hurry would act expeditiously. And sure enough, I found a property that I liked, made an offer significantly under asking, didn't think it would get accepted, got accepted at like within an hour, and wanted to close immediately. And suddenly I felt squeezed. I was like, I wasn't expecting that. And I was a bit short on liquidity. And here's what I did. I learned this from Rick Rule. It's what he used to do. And I withdrew some of my physical gold from my safe, wrote myself a promissory note. Here's what I'm borrowing from my treasury. I'm going to charge myself X ounces as a fee, so no interest rate. The term was, I think, 6 months. I needed to pay it back by January 1st. Liquidated the gold, got the cash, bought the condo, and then over the next 6 months, replenished the reserve with the additional ounces as a fee. And it was like, yeah, you can't actually act as your own bank. And that's very empowering. If you're talking about like appreciating a personal value of mine being personal sovereignty, like what a cool little exercise to go through, right? And actually put that into practice and say, oh, yeah, when people talk about it being a pet rock, it's like, I mean, that wasn't even an emergency. And I optioned the liquidity because I had the option, right? And that's how it can serve you. And you don't go all in. Like, I think that people that have an aversion to precious metals, it's because there's a lot of rhetoric that says, the currency is going to collapse. The sovereign debt bubbles are all going to pop. We're entering a new era. We're going to be, bartering. And it's like, no, we're not going. I mean, hey, anything can happen. I don't think we're going that far into the doom loop, right? I think things get pretty tough. And I just want to make sure I'm prepared. I'm ranting, but here's an analogy that kind of resonates with me if I can, right?
Yeah.
I'm a martial artist. And the reason I'm a martial artist is because when I was 16, I used to get beat up a lot, right? I didn't like it. I was always scared. I got off a bus stop 2 away from the bus stop near my house because there was a gang of kids I never wanted to bump into, right? I know what that's like. I know what it's like to operate from a place of fear. You're reactive. You think short term. You don't act in your best interest, right? Because you're in fight or flight all the time. And once I learned how to defend myself and realized I was actually quite good at it, then I had another option in my back pocket. And that option, when faced with a crisis, was to sit and do nothing and just wait this out and say, look, something's occurring, whether something just, half a block away or somebody right in my face, but I'm just going to wait and see what happens because probably nothing's going to happen. And either way, I'm prepared for it. So I don't have to react. I don't have to think short term. I don't have to run, right? I'm just going to wait this out. And if it really gets bad, like I'm pretty confident I can handle that. I had confidence, right? That's what it is, physical confidence. And precious metals gives me that financial confidence. I never want to need it, but when a crisis occurs, you see what happens to markets and dollars, like panic buying and selling goes crazy, right? Because everyone jumps into fight or flight in a crisis, in a financial crisis. You don't want to do that, right? You want to be patient. You want to sit back. You want to watch. You want to have that option on liquidity and strike when you see something really valuable. It's like, okay, because you can think clearly because you're thinking long term. You've slowed down, and that analogy, just like that's why I own precious metals right there. Simple as that.
To do something similar. When I bought this place, I didn't have to cash out any gold, but drastically underestimating my construction costs, I did. And I learned that from Rick Rule as well. He said, you have to think of these as cash. They're volatile cash, but they're cash. And I got a little fortunate in that when I purchased my gold, I got it at 1,600. A few years later, it was worth 1,750. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I set up a repayment plan kind of like you did, except instead of buying more gold, I went the silver route. So I replaced it. I took the ratio at the moment And I
Yeah,
thought, okay, I'm going to replace this with silver. I got another couple months before I'm even on that. But I thought, you know what, that this did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I
amazing.
feel grateful that I had that option in my back
Yeah,
pocket. I hated to cash it out at the time, but without
yeah,
that, I wasn't able to subsidize the mortgage with the rental unit. But
yeah. You were your own bank. It's very empowering.
exactly. It really takes the stress out of it, like you were talking about with martial arts.
Hmm.
Okay, uranium. What you got some uranium companies coming to your conference? What are your thoughts on uranium? If you could just run through that in a minute or two.
Yeah, I'm going to be upfront. It's not my area of expertise. It's we're hosting, I think, 5 big features on the uranium sector. Not, I mean, honestly, because I tend to build my agenda the same way as I host my podcast. I want to focus on subjects that I'm trying to understand better. The uranium supply and demand economics are much more difficult to wrap your mind around than, say, copper, nickel, silver, or even gold, because a lot of the contracts are dark. You don't see everything, and there's a lot more variables at play. But at a high level, the world is now in an energy crisis. You can't ignore that, right? And so we need solutions, and we need to get creative, and we need to think outside the box. And so, inevitably, you're going to look at countries like France, right, which was a world leader in nuclear power and probably misguidedly decided to become one of the leading investors in solar and wind, which left them quite vulnerable. And now they're refiring their coal plants, right?
Yeah.
Germany is the same, right? Refiring their coal plants. I'm actually going to Germany and Poland the day after my conference to film a documentary on the European energy crisis. We've got a whole bunch of guests that have fled Ukraine, some unfortunate refugees, but a bunch of Germans and Polish individuals who are, everyone's over here talking about, oh, they're heating their homes with wood. It's like, well, let's go find out, right? So we're going to go boots on the ground and just have a bunch of conversations and dig into this a little bit. So, all I would say to you is that, if we're looking for zero emission baseload power, there's not very many things that tick that box, right? And nuclear does, right? And it's been demonized aggressively and unfairly, largely on the back of Greenpeace. And, Warren Irwin at Rosso Asset Management, he's speaking at my conference on Sunday. He was one of the first to call it the BRIEX scandal, like very experienced veteran investor, made himself a pile of money. And, he's pointed to evidence that Greenpeace and their demonizing of the nuclear power industry is largely a consequence of Greenpeace being funded darkly by the coal industry, right? Which makes a ton of sense in the world if you understand just the basics of how lobby groups work. Like, what an efficient mechanism for the coal industry if they could provide some funding to, an environmental protection group that wanted to point the finger at nuclear and the few accidents that have occurred, which were terrible, right? Chernobyl was really bad, but it was also in the 80s and using technology that nobody uses anymore. So, apples to apples in terms of like accidents to utility, nuclear is actually, it stands up, I think, over and above everything else, especially when you look at the new generation small modular reactors, and the safety mechanisms that we've learned, right, from the few accidents that have occurred, right? Everybody points to 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Yeah, those are all really bad. There's 3. Like, count how many times an oil train's gone off the rails, how many times the pipelines burst, like, and we're not moving away from fossil fuels, right? It's a misguided argument. It doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, I would point you to more intelligent uranium investors like Rick Rule. Simply put, either the price goes up or the lights go out. Which do you think is more likely? And then tune into the show, because I'm there to learn honestly about that sector myself. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, your quick thoughts on demographics. Okay, so China's experiencing this right now. I think Japan's going through it right now. They have an aging demographic where, to put it simply, they got more old people than young people. They're, what do you see happening with pension systems, Social Security? When you have more people that are drawing from the system than people that are putting in. The U.S. and Canada is approaching that moment, I believe.
We are, yeah. Russia and China are there. Japan's there, and North America, we're like 40 years behind, and that just means you enter a place where you've got more 70-year-olds than 60-year-olds, more 60 than 50, more 50 than 40, and 40 than 30, and so on. And you need a birth rate of like 2.1 to maintain population, right? Not 2, but 2.1, just because, infant mortality, accidents occur. Not everybody makes it to adulthood.
Yeah.
But that's generally been the rule. And China's a country that's, been operating, they claim, I think at like 1.7 or 1.5, but like, we know the data that comes out of China is often a bit manipulated. And in reality, individuals like Jim Rickards, who's very much boots on the ground in China, predicts it's probably closer to 1.3, if not 1.1. Wow. And as a consequence, you have this absolutely terrifying inverse pyramid when it comes to demographics. And the consequence of that is exactly what you said. You have net contributors, right? And then, a reliant population. So you got the productive working age and the dependent age. And pension systems are quite simple. You're either contributing to it or you're drawing upon it. And that works as long as the contributing population is larger than the population that's drawing upon it. And when that becomes inverse is when you get into trouble. It becomes a unfunded Ponzi scheme, or it looks very similar to one. I wouldn't call it a Ponzi, but the functionality is not too dissimilar. And in addition, right, you have your dependent population and your productive population. But the dependent population don't just suck up pensions and government resources and funding. They need to be cared for, right? And that creates a lot of jobs for the productive population, care homes, nursing programs. But it's not necessarily like they're honorable employment opportunities, but they're not necessarily contributing to the productiveness of the nation, right? Yeah. And so you end up sucking up some of your productive population into honorable employment, but that doesn't really contribute to the GDP of the country, right?
Yeah, you're not making phones by doing that. You're taking care of the elderly.
You're not boosting, economic productivity. And so it's a bit of a problem, right? And you can point to really dramatic forecasts, individuals like Rickards, who sort of feels like this is the final song, right, that we're watching in China right now. Peter Zeihan, another. I don't know if things are that dramatic, but the counter argument to this, I'd say, Steve, is that, how do you solve the inverse pyramid in terms of demographics? People will tell you AI and robotics, right? You're going to need less people to produce just as much. And sure, like you can absolutely speculate that's going to be the case. It's kind of a wait and see thing. We don't know that to be true, but absolutely, there's possibilities there. And I'm long human ingenuity. I think we'll solve our problems. But in the meantime, it's definitely an unsolved one, and one that is rapidly approaching, and an expensive one, a very expensive problem. So, what do you do if you've been working your entire life banking on that pension, and you're one of the first generations that experiences that problem before it's solved, right? You're one of the casualties of this. Let's get back to the importance of personal sovereignty, right? Like, yes. That's why I think it's important to think about this. And we've had it so good in the West for so long that it's easy to think everything's going to be all right, and I don't have to worry about taking care of myself. We see this, right? It's not the case. There's very few little blips in our history of a species where you weren't all on your own at the end of the day. You know what I mean? And I think it's important to retain that perspective that no one's got your back, but that's a good thing because it puts you in the driver's seat and you in control of your destiny, right? Yeah. When you assume someone else has your back, you're more likely to relinquish control. And then you're at the mercy of the current. If that current goes somewhere you don't like, it's like you relinquish control. Now you know what I mean? So don't ever do that. Don't ever, ever, ever do that. Retain your personal sovereignty. Retain direction of your life at all costs, right? It's like the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree. If your pension's still there, look at it as a gift, but assume it ain't going to be, and start taking control of your finances. Okay. What is your recommendation for a guy like me going to your conference for the first time? How can I get the most out of it? I've got a tripod here with a couple of mics to clip on my shirt so that I can interview the guys there. What's your recommendation for me getting the most out of this?
Well, that's a good start. So it's 2 days. We have content going on 7 stages, streaming all day on both days. And so one of the toughest parts is like triaging where you're going to go. You want to hear the panel on M&A in the mining sector, but you also want to hear Grant Williams talk about de-dollarization and then, it's like there's a lot going on. So we do record everything. It's all available on either the Jay Martin Show YouTube channel. If it's a piece that I'm hosting, I'll put it up on my personal YouTube channel. And if it's just, a keynote speech by Rick Rule, by Grant Williams, by Brent Johnson, I'll put that on the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference YouTube channel. But it's all up and it's all free after the fact. So see what you want to see live, and then you can find it all afterwards. But I would say it's a very approachable industry. And if you like the perspective and listening to people like Rick Rule, like Brent Johnson, like Robert Kiyosaki, like Lynette Zhang, like Danielle Park, they're there to connect with their subscribers, their clients, the individuals in the industry, right? And so they'll be on stage, they'll give their talk. If you want to talk to them, just go grab them. Like, it's what's remarkable about this industry is how approachable everybody is at a show like this. And, we definitely build that in. I talked to all my keynote speakers in advance and said, I'd love you just to walk the floor and be present. And if you want a booth, so you can have some time to just be meeting people, shaking hands, signing books, doing whatever, like, we'll provide that for you. But it's very much a community vibe. So, we work really hard at that. So, have a look at the agenda. There's lots going on. Find the subjects that really pique your interest, the individuals you think are the most exciting and interesting. Make sure you hit their workshops, catch it at the speaker hall. And then the main hall, the speaker hall, is where a lot of the, a lot of my favorite content goes down. I can just put it that way, So we open up the show with a big deep dive on the gold sector. We're talking, having some macro debates on the morning of day one with Grant Williams, Brent Johnson, with Frank Justra, Rick Rule, talking about, what does de-dollarization look like? How near term is this? What's the next decade? How do you expect? And these are all forecasts and speculation, but it's interesting hearing everybody's unique perspectives, because you have some US dollar bears like Grant Williams and some US dollar bulls like Brent Johnson. And it's fun teeing them off against each other, and you can hear both perspectives, right? In a sort of debate format. I love sharing this stuff. And so that's a lot of what we do in the speaker hall, is the bigger conversations. And I try to have more debate style conversations. That's where we'll be sitting down with Premier Clark, with Premier Wall. We've got to focus on where the smart money is going in 2023, with a lot of legendary investors who just have 50-year track records, of making money in good markets and bad. And obviously, I want to know where they're putting their cash today. I mean, I'm a retail investor just like my audience, right? And so I build the agenda so that I can benefit from it, so that I can find out, where are the legendary investors putting cash right now? What are the serially successful entrepreneurs like Ross Beatty? I'll square off with him for 20 minutes. I mean, the guy's built 14 companies, 14 of which provided 10 baggers to his shareholder base. Like, who else in the history of has ever done that? He's the broken slot machine. It's mind boggling, right? And so you want to find out, what's he doing next, right? And I want to talk to him about the future of Equinox, among many, many other things. Where's he putting cash as an investor? Because Ross is a very active investor in the space. And so, it's built for retail to figure out, how do you put yourself in front of the tsunami, right? That's what we're all trying to figure out in this game, right? Is, where's the next avalanche of money going to hit? I want to get there first and put myself in front of it. So, a lot of eyes looking at the gold sector, a lot of eyes looking at the copper sector. We've got a whole deep dive on copper, where we're asking the question, is, what is peak cheap copper? Are we there, right? Or is it close? If you look at the forecast coming out of even Davos this week, they're waving the flag for EV everything. Well, it's like, it's going to take a lot of metals. So I'm just really curious.
Principally copper. You can't do without copper.
A lot of it, it makes it a pretty simple bet, to be honest with you. You don't have to get too nuanced with the energy metals to just look at what's the best conductor, and it's going to be needed in everything, no matter which direction battery chemistry goes. It's a steadfast hallmark ingredient. We're having a lot of conversations on the definition of renewable energy, because it's worth discussing, right? Like, there's a lot of posturing right now about how we need to end the fossil fuel era. And I'm not opposed to that. I got 3 kids. I want them to grow up in a clean, sustainable, beautiful world. And I've spent a lot of my life in really remote parts of British Columbia. I think I understand what we stand to lose if we don't take care of our environment. I just wonder if the same individuals who are calling for the end of the fossil fuel era are then going to pivot their voices to call for us to permit every single mine everywhere around the world, so that we have the minerals we need, right, to build these renewable energy technologies. Because you need that, right? You need the ingredients. So it's like, I just don't think that's very realistic, that the same politicians and voices that are saying, cancel fossil fuels are suddenly going to say, and permit every mine because we're going to need a ton of minerals. It's like, we'll see how that plays out. So diving into like what's renewable about the renewable energy sector, it's a misnomer. We're going to pivot. We're going to pivot from fossil fuels. That's going to happen. Like we pivoted from horse-drawn cars to cars, and cars were one day the environmentally clean solution to London and New York City that were just drowning in horse manure, right? If you go back to like, 1896 was the great horse manure crisis in London, and economists were forecasting within a decade, every city in London will be under 9 feet of manure. It was like they were forecasting the end of urban civilization.
I read that same report. Yes.
Yeah, they were drowning in feces, man, and dead horse bodies. The horses they just leave them there. They didn't have waste removal. And so when Henry Ford was able to scale an automobile and make it affordable to the average middle-class human being, it was like, we're going to clean up the world, right? Like no more manures. And, we take everything too far. Then you gotta pivot, find something different, right? So we'll pivot and find something different. I just don't think it's what we're being sold right now by our renewable energy pundits most of the time. Just my thoughts.
Yeah. Right on. Cool. Okay. I didn't realize I was going to have to triage quite so much. I printed out the itinerary. So I'll go through that right after this and try to highlight the ones that I just can't miss. So,
well, we try to compartmentalize in one workshop. You'll see primarily gold content. Another, you'll see primarily silver. Another, you'll see primarily energy, and not entirely, but we try to compartmentalize as best we can. Just so if you want to, grab a good seat and sit down for 2 hours, you got relevant stuff coming at you. But it is a big agenda. So review it and find the names you want to see. If you're on the website, you just go to our speakers page. Yeah. And if you click on Rick Rule, you'll see everything Rick is doing. And Rick is doing like 7 different things. Like he's on, 6, 7 different panels plus a keynote. You want to know what Brent Johnson's doing? Just go to our speakers page, click on Brent. You don't have to go through the agenda. The Brent Johnson speaker profile will show you every appearance that Brent has, when it is, what it is, where it is, all that stuff. And so it makes it quite easy to navigate. If you want to make sure you don't miss a single thing that Robert Kiyosaki is doing, same thing, just go to his page. You'll know where he's going to be when, and then you can work from there.
Awesome. Right on. Well, thank you very much, Jay. This has been a lot of fun. I look forward to meeting you in person, and I really look forward to the conference. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. Make sure you grab me in the aisle, Steve, and we'll hang out. But looking forward to it, man.
I will. And the listener can check you out on the Jay Martin Show on YouTube. Love all the content that you put out, and keep the train running, man.
Likewise.
All right. You have a good rest of the day, sir.
You too. All right.